Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us from various parts of the globe. My name is Liat Margolis, and I serve as the Director of the Landscape Architecture Program at the Daniels Faculty. Before we start, I'd like to make you aware that today's event is being recorded and broadcast on our YouTube channel. So I'd ask you to please turn off your camera if you do not wish to be recorded. You're welcome to stay on, of course. I also ask you to keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation, and during the Q&A session, which will follow our guest's talk, you can type your questions in the chat. And alternatively, you can also identify yourself in the chat if you wish to speak, and we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. So today I have the great honor of co-hosting Kenyan-based landscape architect and educator Arthur Adeya, who's joining us from Nairobi. This event is one of several at the Daniels Faculty this academic year that aims to open focused conversations on systemic racism and the ways in which we can all become sensitively aware and accountable to the necessary changes in the academy and professional practice to promote social justice, both locally and internationally. This event is co-organized and co-hosted with MLA alumna Kaari Kitawi, who also hails from Kenya. In the wake of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests, Kaari, who graduated from our program in 2015, wrote a powerfully honest and eye-opening account of her experience in the landscape program. And I will share her article, the link to her article in the chat shortly. Kaari and I had the opportunity to connect and share her academic and professional experience since arriving in Canada, which, if I may share your story, Kaari, has had its positive aspects with no doubt, but it also is important to acknowledge her experience of systemic racism, which in Kaari's case was also compounded by her experience as a Kenyan immigrant to Canada. One of Kaari's apt critiques of our faculty, MLA program, and professional practice more broadly was the lack of representation and exposure to African voices in design. And so I'm absolutely thrilled that Arthur accepted our invitation and that we all have the opportunity to learn about his journey and introspection around the context and histories that shape us, as he puts it, and the deep-seated biases that are the basis for institutional discrimination. It is with this spirit of humility and respect, and on behalf of the Daniels faculty and community, that I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations ancestral and treaty lands in which the University of Toronto is located. I'd like to honor the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations, as well as the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who call the Greater Toronto Area their home. I'd like to introduce Kaari Kitawi, who will be co-moderating the discussion today. Kaari is a landscape architect and urban designer. She graduated from the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the University of Toronto and has a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Kenya. Prior to moving to Canada, Kaari ran her own landscape firm, Refuge Gardens, for over 10 years. Her company had diverse projects of varied scales and scope in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Djibouti. Her clients include Deloitte, Toyota, East Africa Community Parliament, East African Breweries, Daystar University, Kenya Airways, and a Shipai Resort and Spa, among others. Kaari is a full member of the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects and currently works in city planning at the City of Toronto as an urban designer. And now I'd like to invite Kaari to introduce our very special guest today.
Okay, thank you so much, Liat, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for joining us from around the world. as Liat has pointed out, the recent events in the US and the agitation for justice and equality by the Black Lives Matter movement has forced many organizations such as all over the world to re-examine how their practices may have contributed to the discrimination or exclusion of Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color. And indeed, this is an opportune moment for all institutions to redress this. We have been, as Liat has pointed out, we have been, a number of alumni have been working with the Daniels faculty to see how we can make an improvement. And I want to thank Liat for following through on some of the suggestions which were made, which is to have, as she has said, more Black voices at events like this. And thank you all for attending to support this. Today, I'm extremely honored to host Arthur Adeya. Arthur is a talented Kenyan architect, artist, educator, and landscape professional. He graduated among the top of his class in architecture program at the University of Nairobi. He has a master's of landscape architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And while at Harvard, he was awarded the Norman T. Newton Prize for landscape architecture student whose work best exemplifies achievement in design expression as realized in any medium. The American Association of Landscape Architects awarded him the ASLA Certificate of Honor for demonstrating a high degree of academic scholarship and accomplishment in skills related to the art and technology of landscape architecture. He worked for some of the leading design firms in the US, such as EDSA and HOK, before returning to Kenya in 2010. I have known Arthur for a long time. He was classmates with my husband, David, at architecture school, and I have pretty much just backed on their friendship and their relationship and benefited immensely from it. Arthur is deeply committed to uplifting those around him with his skills and his knowledge. I remember whenever he would come back to Kenya on vacation from the US, he'd always make a point of dropping by my office to share some of the snippets of whatever he was learning in school or at work, have a long list of books I should read or websites I should look at. And even sometimes we would sit down and work on a sketch model. And all that, of course, helped me to become a better designer. So thank you all. Thank you, Arthur, for availing yourself to share with us what you've been up to. And I just want to ask the audience, if it's possible, you can give a very warm wave in the air to welcome Arthur.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all. A little strange to have the wave and to know that it's now time to start speaking, but I think I'll pick it up quickly. I want to say a very big thank you to the Daniels Faculty Lecture Series for inviting me to give this talk to the Department of Landscape Architecture. Liat, I've known Liat for a while. I knew her when she was at the GSD, and it's good to see your passion coming through. I remember you drove the materials library at the GSD, and I've been seeing the great work that's happening at Great Lab at the Daniels School. Kaari, thank you very much for a fantastic introduction. I must say that Kaari's journey is probably one of the most remarkable, and it would be fantastic to hear her speak as well at a later date, as you clearly had Bachelor of Science in Mathematics. And I just saw the other day when she was officially a landscape architect, having passed all her licensure exams. It's just an absolutely fantastic story. So it's a great honor to be welcomed by two people of great passion who I respect tremendously. When we first started having this conversation around what this talk would be with Liat and Kaari, I figured that what I might just want to do is just to share my thoughts, and share my thoughts through, I hope you can see my screen, through the lens of my sketchbooks. When we wrote the title out, I thought that I might be sharing one sketchbook at a time, but as you can see, I am now up to number 20. And that's only from about 2006. So really what I figured out how to do is try and share snippets and images and a brief way in which I've always thought through drawing and through sketches. I'm going to do this in 3 parts. First, I'll go through a brief history of my early journey, and I'm calling this before I started sketching from life. I'd always drawn, but I would draw either from photographs or from imagination. And around 2015, I started sketching from life, and that had a profound shift, and I'll try and walk through that. So I wanted to start off with this image, and this is from 1987. I was still in primary school, and the title of the composition, and this was actually an exam piece, was Transportation in My Country. And I was looking at this recently, and I was a bit perplexed about why I chose to put that filled up bus, the little half truck, half pickup truck following it is called a matatu, and then the train. And yet I was relatively privileged and always traveled to school. I was dropped in school. I was picked from school in a private vehicle. Yet when I was doing transportation in my country, this is what I wanted to depict. Looking further was also the notion of where the city was in this picturesque landscape. This, remember, is a 12, 13-year-old boy drawing this. And this wasn't my landscape. This wasn't the way the city actually looked. At the background, that would possibly be true, but it wasn't sitting in this picturesque landscape. Yet I seemed to want to aspire to that. I found a second image, which was also very interesting. It's same exam, and this one was supposed to be atmospheric composition. And again, 12, 13-year-old, and what I really want to show is my country in this glorious savanna. On one side, I'm probably showing to the left, I'm probably showing a more man-made landscape, which is really farmlands. You have the train, and then a picturesque savanna. Well, for me, there was questions about, as I look at this today, there were questions about why was this imprinted in my ethos, and why was I thinking of landscape and of our spaces this way? And as we go along further, you'll begin to see how some of this begins to break the mold. Jump ahead very quickly, and these are my sketchbooks from my university, my undergraduate architecture school. To the top, that hopefully it's the left-hand side, you probably see me struggling with creating all this, as we'd refer to them, dynamic forms. The impression always was that we would create these beautiful objects in space, and either probably sitting in a nice picturesque landscape. And the aspiration was always to something, and I'm struggling, I keep struggling with this word because I don't want to use the word beautiful, because it's exactly exemplifying the struggles we had as young people over what we understand to be beautiful versus what we understand to be useful. But the beauty was something that was not us, and I'll show that a little bit later in a subsequent sketch. This project was in our 5th year, and the title of the project was actually low-cost housing. I've just taken out one of my analyses, and it, in retrospect, became my most profound project. It wasn't the one we really wanted to do because it didn't offer us an opportunity to really get into high architectures, we referred to it. It didn't give us an opportunity to create these lovely landscapes, as we would refer to them, with lots of flowers and lawn. And it required us to deeply analyze a situation. And this was 1998. I still hold on to this sketch to this day and share it. It came from the Mimar magazine, and it says, coming soon, low-income housing. And the guys looking at it below there say, behold, from the people who brought us low income. I'm not sure I truly understood that in full context because I removed myself from those people who brought us low income. And I laughed together with everybody else at me being part of the team that is understanding the plight and the concerns of the low income communities. Yet that was not true. My aspiration was still towards giving them good housing, giving them good landscapes. And it took some time to really begin to think through what that really means. And as I said, most of this is sketches from magazines, sketches from imagination, sketches from design, and really 2015 is where a difference begins to happen. So one more, and this is at the GSD. And when talking about diversity and talking about exposure to different opportunities and what that exposure can do, in this project, the most significant thing for me, and the one that I remember the most, it sounded a little bit strange. I was creating this fantastic coastal landscape, wanted to create a series of different levels, nice parks for people to recreate, kite flying, and I was building a boardwalk to link the fragmented landscapes. I hope my pointer could show. And I still remember a desk crate, and the lecturer came up to me because I initially put a very tiny little boardwalk, and it was really for people to walk through. And professor asked me, this is a fantastic opportunity to do something at a great scale, allow cars on board, let it connect the road that was to the north and the road to the south. And it just struck me at the moment he was saying that. I didn't tell him, I don't think I really spoke to this to anybody else, that I had constantly been penny pinching all my life. And I could not imagine that I could do a boardwalk that would take cars. I didn't know I was allowed to. And here I was at the GSD in my, this I think was my 4th semester. And I don't even know how I can explain how profound that was for me at that particular point in time, to imagine that I was limiting myself to that regard, and immediately began to try and consider, if I am here, what are the limitations for everybody else? How are these differences occurring and how are they manifesting? And this is around the point where we began to consider creating KDI, which I will speak to a little bit later. And the whole notion was about how can we leapfrog? How can we create something that would work both in a situation where resources may not be as available as say in the US, and still make it meaningful. Because as I allude to in most of my earlier sketches that I was talking about, majority of the time I was aspiring to get away and get to plenty of resource. And here was suddenly an opportunity where I'm realizing that I've actually limited myself. I'm aspiring to these fantastic landscapes, but I am already limited in my original thoughts. So as I jump to sketching from life, this is about 2017. I started sketching from life in late 2016. And this was from my office, looking out to the one of the streets in Nairobi. It's called Aga Khan Walk. I purposely decided for the purpose of this lecture that I'm not going to share any pictures. I'll just share my sketches to allow the imagination to grow and understand. So these were the type of sketches I was interested in doing. I was sketching buildings, and I really wanted to figure out how could we improve the Aga Khan work? How could we create a nice urban setting, almost in the context of what you might find in Toronto, in New York. And then I went to Uhuru Park. Uhuru Park is perhaps the most prominent and largest park in Nairobi, public park. It's essentially picturesque in its design, rolling landscapes, not as well maintained as it could be. And I know there's a lot of work apparently going on to try and improve it, but it has this nice water bodies. And this was a sketch I did from the park looking across to the central business district. And the tower you can see there is the KICC, which for a long time was the tallest building in Nairobi, built in '73. It has since been surpassed. And this sketch could be just about anywhere. But this was the reflection of what many of us want to understand, most of us want to aspire to, in saying that we then have a beautiful landscape. A couple more sketches from the same day. That's actually Nairobi. That's the UAP Towers. I think inspired by the Empire State Building. And in the bottom is a little bit of a sketch that is beginning to allude to my actual interests. And in this particular day, maybe as you see there, I've been wanting to sketch this for the longest time. This is Nairobi. And I'm really proud about this being Nairobi. Yet at the same time, I began to realize that the recreational opportunities being offered were really not the same. I don't recreate in Uhuru Park. It's a public park. I probably go to more private settings. And there's already a separation being created there that stemmed from a long historical past. This was perhaps my favorite sketch of the day, and I'll explain the historical past that I'm speaking about. But towards the end of the day, we decided to have some refreshments, and it was just fascinating to see this guy who has put together his setup all from Coca-Cola crates and fridges. And for me, what was beginning to happen here is I was beginning to try and understand how the type of spaces that are needed, the type of spaces that maybe I should be figuring out, how do you create? And one of the beauties of sketching from life is that I looked keenly at a number of these items. I looked keenly at how he sets up the crates, and this began a fascination for me with these umbrellas. And if you travel around, this one is Africa-wide. You'll see a lot of these umbrellas. They became the single most important thing. Yet we've not really, as a landscape architect, and as several landscape architects, Kaari, I can say, is nodding to this, we've probably eschewed this because this does not aspire to what we derived from our colonial past. Again, the Coca-Cola vendors, fantastic and interesting. I remember speaking to this guy, and he actually rents this space. He doesn't own. So there's an additional layer into him coming into this space. So this will really begin to explain it. I now am at the top of KICC, and I'm looking to the western side of the city. And the real scenario is that the underlying master plan of Nairobi comes from a master plan for a colonial capital in 1948. It has been improved over time. Changes have been made to it. There's been a 72 plan, but the underlying structure is from the master plan of a colonial capital. So what was the colonial capital? It had a distinct space for whites, it had a distinct space for Africans, and it had a distinct space for Indians. And to the west was really where the whites were. More centrally were the Indians, and to the east were the Africans. And this sketch that I would take looking to the west kind of gives the impression of a green city in the sun. That's our Nairobi moniker, welcome to the green city in the sun. And this was more central. So the KICC, as you saw, is this circular building. I'm at the top, right at the top, sketching. This is more central, looking to the CBD, but still beyond, you're looking to some of the low density suburban neighborhoods. And then to the east, and maybe I even got afraid of sketching some of the elements further out. But the density in terms of height reduces, yet as you will see a little bit later, the closer you go, the density in terms of proximity and density of buildings actually begins to increase. And this is the genesis of my biases and my aspirations. I aspired to living in the western side. I aspired to living in a 1 acre plot, green lawn, single building. And in reflection, as I traveled more, began to realize that, and this is just what it is. It's not about being hypercritical, but it's about being sensitive at a personal level. And it's about being sensitive to my own discriminations, even as we are talking about diversity, and the situation in Canada would be different from the situation in Kenya. But even from within Kenya myself, I am aspiring to the sort of lifestyle that the colonialists had. But the interesting thing for me, as I began to sketch more, I began to realize that the life the colonialist and the settler lived in Kenya, which would be different from, say, Uganda, would be different from the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the settler life that they lived in Kenya was not the predominant lifestyle that occurred in London at the time. So the settlers in Kenya came and they were living in large farms, they were living in ranches, they were living in large parcels of land. But London at the time was dense, interesting, vibrant, mixed use, and growing. And so the aspiration we developed was not actually a Western aspiration, but was a settler aspiration. And what then begins to tend to happen is we begin to want and believe that is what is beautiful. And that is what is good landscape. And anything else that becomes too dense or it doesn't work. And I like to use the analogy that many people want to imagine that once they came to the city, nobody else should come in. And we all should keep living in vast pieces of land. This is the aspiration. This one sketch is one that I've not necessarily done from life, but I was copying something from Shanghai. And this is what we all want at the planning level. We all want to imagine that Nairobi could be when we talk about density. These are a couple of sketches of the skyline of Nairobi that we would want to sell. And you notice the skyscrapers beginning to come. It's really developing and it's really booming, and it's really interesting when you take it from some of these perspectives at a much higher level. I do tend to like to say, this is from my office again. I do try to sketch, and I want to see if I can keep a record of the transformations of the skyline. But this is the reality. And this suddenly became very clear to me. Majority of Nairobians live in a 50 by 100 plot or 40 by 80 plot. And I'm not fully aware of the genesis of the 40 by 80 or 50 by 100. But part of my understanding is that it was the single smallest plot that you could get a separate, an individual title. And what happened as the population began to increase in the 2000s, and there was good economic growth around 2002, a lot of individual developers would go buy large parcels of land and chop it up into 50 by 80 parcels of 50 by 100, 40 by 80 parcels. And these parcels were typically supposed to be for a single family house. But the market was stronger. And one of my favorite readings from last year is A Triumph of the City by Ed Glazer and Order Without Design by Eileen Bertrand, both speaking about how, as designers and planners, we must begin to understand what the market is seeking. We must begin to understand urban economics, because urban economics is essentially stronger than any plans that we can create. And so my interest and fascination with the 40 by 80, the 50 by 100, 40 by 80 began to grow. And I began to ask myself why I had considered all this undesirable and ugly. And through a series of sketches began to ask. And one of the fascinating things, if I may say so myself, a sketch kind of makes it look interesting and makes it look vibrant. And that's why I've purposely not shown any pictures, because suddenly as I began to think about it, I realized that perhaps the biggest problem was that we had never really designed or planned for the 50 by 100, for the 40 by 80, because those were not desirable. They were not 1 acre plots for single family dwellings. They were not supposed to be the aspiration that we lived through. Yet, if I go to Barcelona, those are the blocks that they have. This density, yet when you go to the street level, it's actually nice and interesting. And this was not a sketch from life, but this was me taking a stab and saying, if we had a single, if we had a block and we had 10 50 by 100s, if we just saved 2 for a little public park, the character of the street would become very different. If we had actually engaged and not allowed our biases and prejudices to fight the 50 by 100 parcel, we would have actually considered and created a much more fantastic and realistic town that would actually be both understanding the urban economics, but tapping into the genuine energy of the people. This is a sketch from life. It's a place called Saika. Kaari might know it well. And I think when I sketch it, I make it look a lot more interesting and a lot more exciting than it really is. Hopefully one of these days you might go and take a look at the actual pictures of the area. But then for me, what it affords is the suggestion that if well done, if well designed, if this is a space that we went into, we would actually be able to create a very unique city. That did not mean that we essentially treated this as a non-desirable. And I know this is beginning to maybe want to take a step back here and just try and consider this. The struggles and diversity you've been speaking about are systemic racism, systemic discrimination. Yet, when I think about it, I also realize that at a local level in Kenya, we actually have those issues and those problems, and not necessarily from a racial perspective, but from a class perspective. And that word class is difficult to use again, but we have created and imprinted certain elements are not, how would I put this, are not supposed to be they are not supposed to be what we are aspiring to as a nation. And that aspiration, as I have said, is false. And once everybody is able to step back and begin to look internally a little bit more, they might begin to understand that there's a separate direction. For me, this journey has been through sitting here on a Sunday afternoon for an hour or so, actually sketching. And what this does not show is the diversity and the change that's happening and the movement that's happening. What you might notice is this right here is a church abutting right next to essentially what are mixed use developments. And one of the fascinating things that we as middle-class Kenyans and upper-class Kenyans absolutely detest is clothes hanging from the balcony. And we have a lot of that. And one of the things that happens when you get an opportunity to sit and sketch in one of these neighborhoods that I did on this day on November 2nd, I suddenly asked myself, why would I be worried about clothes hanging from a balcony when somebody is worried about where they would be living? It's not like I was walking right under there and maybe it's dripping on me. It's not like my clothes are right below, but there's 6, 7 stories, everybody is hanging clothes. But my discrimination was really about saying, guys should understand, hanging clothes off a balcony makes a space ugly. When I did the sketch, I suddenly realized that it doesn't, but there are certain things that we should be able to do to improve the conditions, to improve the landscape. Again, this is a live sketch. Part of the sad risks is while this space here is open, it's definitely earmarked for development. If from what we've beginning to think, if we could defend this and get it into a nice little park, then we begin to enrich the space. And yeah, I do tend to write a bit, and I was trembling with excitement when I was sketching this at the missed opportunities that we had as designers who had eschewed a number of the spaces. Maybe I'll just highlight this sketch for the mango guy. Again, this was live. This is 23rd last year, just before Christmas, 21st December, sketching at a toy market. And one of the most fascinating things is this guy came with his wheelbarrow, placed his wheelbarrow and suddenly started selling mangoes in the middle of the street. The mango guys basically came right at that point. And within a flash, he was suddenly the busiest person. It was a Saturday morning, if I remember right. I want to feel like in 5 minutes, he had sold 30 or so mangoes. And just like that, I raised my head and he was gone. And this used to be a road, but it's been taken over by a market. And a very interesting and thriving market. And for me, the question again was, have we been thinking clearly about this sort of spaces, about what they should be, about the mango guy in all my design work? And is this aspiration here that I've done, I think this was on the 14th and I copied this, how can this reality that we have below for our streets actually become something that we begin to perceive as desirable? Yes, again, that shows the mango guy in context, that shows the interesting street that has been created. And as I said, this is actually a road that maybe should never have been a road, but the sketches make them look a lot more desirable and a lot more interesting. And I do believe with better planning, it actually creates an opportunity that we can truly pursue. I'll just move through this. This was a market in a small town called Sagana, about 1 hour from Nairobi. And I put this sketch here for one specific reason. We took our students from the Department of Landscape Architecture to Sagana, and they're to redesign the market. And in one of the site analyses, as one of the students was presenting, I noticed they had idlers. IDLERS. I just need to make sure everybody understands. They said they were idlers in the market. And it hit me. It was like a punch in the face. And we began to have an interesting debate with the students. And I asked them, what do you mean idlers? How do you know they are idling? And the origin of that word, because I asked, I mean, maybe the guy decided he wanted to come rest in the market that day, left work the day before, and what better place for them to relax than in the market if you create a good public park. But as we inquired deeper, the origin of that word actually comes from a colonial past. This is almost 58 years later since we got independence. The students are probably 19, 20 years, so probably born 2000. Kenya got independence in 1963, but they actually wrote the word idlers. And what the origin is that in the early, during the colonial times, Africans were only allowed to come to town to work. And they had a system called the Kipande system, which was really a chain with the identification card that you had to walk around within the town to indicate that you had a job to do. And that is how idling came, because if you are an African, you couldn't be just in the town, enjoying the town. You were either working or you were idling. And so it really hit me hard to think that in 2020, and this was right at the beginning, just before the pandemic, a student had actually indicated the word idling. And maybe that's when the question of how do we really understand ourselves and our spaces really came about. This very quickly, 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon in June, one of the sad projections is Africans being lazy or Kenyans being lazy. And I began to wonder, just thinking about my opportunities that allowed me 3:30 in an afternoon to be sketching all these people hard at work. This is our street, Ngong Road, that is filled with, and you see the full mix. There are fruit sellers, there's a hardware, a little bit further back, there are furniture makers. I like this little thing, and I've indicated that this thing that looked like a boulder was actually a pile of dirt that was being moved. And by the time I finished my sketch, it was gone. And so in 30 minutes, these guys had cleared all this and roadworks were continuing. I probably left at about 4 and everybody was hard at work. And it struck me that they had also been there probably way earlier, maybe 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m. They start their day, and the reflections of opportunity that we have and the diversity and the difference were very profound at that actual moment. Likewise, this same street on a separate day, this little cat here is called Mkokoteni, and it was very interesting. I still remember it was the first thing I sketched, because the last weekend, which was this weekend, I noticed one, and before I knew it had gone. So this time I decided I would sketch it first. And what it is, they sit in the island of the road, and you have all these furniture makers, and every now and then somebody comes, grabs them Mkokoteni and transports something from one place to the other. You can see this on this end. And I began to see a hierarchy. You have the guys sanding, who looked like the youngest people, the guys cutting, who look a bit older, the joiners. But you also notice the quality of vehicles that are here shopping right in front. And so you have this wide diversity between the people who might feel the spaces like this are disorganized, yet they want to purchase quality furniture at an affordable rate from the same place, and the person who is actually just sanding. And I hesitate to imagine how much the guy sanding makes in a day, yet to think that they actually have, there's the temerity to almost refer to them as lazy. But then to also think that we've not really considered them when creating space. We are considering something a lot more, for lack of a better term, esoteric. This was a bit of a close-up, and I like this sketch in particular because I left this space as white. So I think there was a big car here that moved off, and the sketch ended up being interesting. But some of the learnings that I was getting from this is how to use materials that are available. This is metal facing. There's some mesh here with timber offcuts, interesting signage. I loved this feature at the back that was, I think, created from offcuts. And I was suddenly beginning to realize that this is really the height of design, and that we are missing the opportunity by not studying some of the spaces deeply. You'll notice here there's always overhead power lines, which creates interesting things. And as I write, one thing for certain, you cannot suggest that any of these people are lazy. I was quite unable to capture it, but several did have masks, and the magic happens outdoors. This was during the COVID times. So I want to maybe segue to KDI, which was born out of my time at the Graduate School of Design. And as I mentioned, when we began to consider Leapfrog, together with Patrick Karen, Shelina Odbat, Jennifer Toy, and Coach Vorokan, 5 students, 4 landscape architects, 1 urban planner, came together and began to ask ourselves, how can we work a little bit more in contested and underprivileged and marginalized communities? And the thought at the time was to create something similar to a Landscape Architects Without Borders, because I admitted to myself even at that point that this would not sufficiently remunerate me, and I needed something a little bit more. But we thought of it as a situation where you could go in for 2 weeks, work with a community organization, share your design ideas, and then allow it to build up. It has since transformed, and now it's a non-profit design community development organization. What we do is we partner with under-resourced communities to advance equity, activate and realize potential in their neighborhoods and cities. And we accomplish this mission through advocacy, research, planning, and built works. KDI has now completed nearly 20 projects in 10 years across Africa, Latin America, the United States, shows the key areas that we have operated in there. We have presence in Stockholm, Kenya, Ghana, Haiti, and LA. It's a group now of architects, engineers, urban planners, landscape architects, community experts. We have some financial experts and researchers. And the basis of it is to consistently figure out neighborhood equity. And we do design, build, plan and program, advocate and educate, and research and test what we refer to as productive public spaces. So productive public space, we see this as being layered. It has an economic, social, and physical component. Under economic, you're looking at savings and loan, food security, some small enterprise. Social, you want spaces of public assembly, public recreation, access and infrastructure. And a physical, you want watershed stabilization, pollution reduction, and environmental remediation. We want to talk about the Kibera productive public space projects. Just to show location, Kibera is one of the largest informal settlements in Nairobi. That's a highlight of the context. And so to rush through just to give you a context of the scale in comparison to Central Park. It's maybe about 70 hectares big. One of the reasons for the image you see here is Kibera is essentially government land within the city of Nairobi. And being government land, the government, central government in the past could give permission for temporary use. However, the city bylaws would then clearly define the materials that you are required to use when building for temporary use. And as such, the buildings thus become a lot of metal, corrugated metal roof, earthen walls, and timber. So you couldn't use stone or anything that was considered a lot more permanent. Hence the actual look. And perhaps the other thing to figure out is, of course, they will use the cheapest corrugated metal, which would rust over time. KDI today is now working on its 11th productive public space. First was completed in 2010, coming out from 2006. And location here that's referred to as around Undugu in Soweto. And the 11th is currently under construction in Makina right now. Said KDI recognizes that poverty in Kibera involves a complex set of interconnected problems: financial, environmental, physical, political, and social. But then it also acknowledges the assets, community activism, informal economies, and entrepreneurship. And you can see this are very similar to some of the ideas that have emanated, that have developed over time. And KDI has been actually operating in parallel at the same time. And it's interesting, from time to time, when we meet up, we realize that our ideas are actually converging in terms of what is important. So just very quickly highlight a couple of the projects. This is the first public space project, and this was a before picture. It was essentially at the mouth of a dam, and so all the rubbish that would be washed off from the informal settlement would come and settle there. We were able to reclaim this through a series of gabions and actually create this space. Physical, we actually built a bridge that connected that area. One of the reasons without a bridge, it actually became an area that was not heavily used, and that's why it is a major dumping ground. There's a multi-purpose hall that we built, a playground, an office, which goes hand in hand with the garden and greenhouse, a Sandries kiosk, and a park and access road. Our social was really community programming. We worked with community group in the church, and then management training skills. And then for economic, we had a community hall rental water tap, a savings and loan program, basket weaving cooperative, and a vegetable compost business. I want to highlight the water tap. And one of the things we have found since 2010 is perhaps the most important economic activity in Kibera is actually water and the sales of water. Once the community is able to sell water, it generates sufficient revenue. And it's actually interesting right now during the COVID period, some of their water revenues have gone down because the government has been providing water for sanitation. So it's an interesting double-edged sword. This just picked up a few quick highlights. This is from Public Space 7. Again, a similar thing, maybe just to also explain how we go about acquiring the sites. KDI actually runs an RFP process that works with community-based organizations who then respond and say they have a space and they have a plan in which they can partner with KDI to develop a public space. And just to show what has become almost a consistent program element, and I was highlighting that a sanitation block becomes a major element, and rainwater harvesting, plus actually a water, in addition to other water sources, but you need to sell water. There's a lined channel. That's really because you have a lot of drainage coming from the rest of the development coming through. A bridge, again, one of the things we always find is that once there's no connection, the place starts becoming derelict because probably everybody is going around and coming back through to this space. And then gabions to begin to protect the river's edge. And in this, there's a planted revetment, which really was planted, gabions. And then you begin to create a public space that can actually become defensible when you have all those layered. I should mention that we learned this in the first project, that without all this additional layering of economic and social engagement, the space evaporated over time and the space was taken over for other activities. And so this shows a before and after. One of the things that KDI has been very keen is to always ensure there's a design element. This is an image. Construction is now complete, could have shared, but there's always still a very strong design component. And then this is Public Space 10, and you notice a lot of similarities. There's a community laundry pad, again, washing opportunities, shaded sitting area, a planted bed, the gabions again, another bridge, a children's play area, and a water tank. What I should have mentioned is that the overall strategy that we took right at the beginning, and I'll just go back to this image, sorry, was to look along the river's edge and to try and identify a network of opportunities along the river and along the valleys that we could create a series of productive spaces that would eventually create an overall network. And so this is a 10 before and after, and you notice that this actually becomes a major meeting space, a play space, a gathering space. These are the water buckets, water containers that they're coming to buy water from. And yes, so finally, just to close, COVID has been interesting. I think I've spoke a lot longer than I'd anticipated. but one of the things about suddenly having to look into Zoom is to suddenly discover that you're looking at yourself a lot. And I decided, been working through this series of sketches as I begin to think through, but there's the internal fight between sketching what you see and what you think you see. And I've learned a lot about myself through sketching, and I'm also learning a lot about myself through sketching myself. I used to think of this guy as rather handsome, so I do my best to add features that captures the artist's license, and I quite enjoy it. And I think if we did the same for our urban spaces, at least from my end, if we looked at these spaces that we didn't think were as handsome, we could actually greatly improve them. Yeah, so that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. That was fantastic. And there is a comment here in the chat from one of our participants, I mean, actually several participants, saying that your drawings are just phenomenal, and asking if you are posting your sketches and watercolors online, because those would be a great resource for architecture students. So if you haven't done so already, here's a big encouragement for you to do so.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I've actually been posting some, but I'll be very honest, I am working on a book. And so I've been saving some for the book, and let's see where that will go. But thank you very much.
Excellent. I wanted to maybe kick us off, if you don't mind. I mean, first, I'd like to invite all of our guests to share your thoughts, comments, questions. If you wish, you can post them in the chat, or you can also ask to for us to unmute you if you want to speak directly. But I wanted to, first just comment on such a insightful and introspective work and presentation, and this kind of deep observation, this kind of slow observation, even though your drawings are very fast. It's phenomenal what you can do in 30 minutes. But this kind of attention to the detail, which have opened your own eyes to the kind of biases, the internalized racism, if you will, if you can call it that, right? I mean, your story about the idling is to me so much of that, right? This kind of notion of taking the colonial history of oppression and just spitting that out casually, day to day by everyday students, not even noticing that they're the connotation of something like that, the history of that, and also what you described as the settler aspiration, versus making that distinction between what, the Western or European aspiration or image, narrative, and ideas of beauty versus the kind of the clear observation of how that lands in a colonial context as a new settler narrative, a new settler aesthetic that is then absolutely internalized as what is defined as beautiful or what is defined as ugly. And that you have to then wrestle with your own self, at this stage of your career with, to sit there and wrestle with yourself, intellectually saying to yourself, clotheslines are not ugly, but inside of yourself saying they are ugly. And having to reconcile that, right? Because this is what's been this is how you've been brought up to actually, you know, look at specific types of housing and say, I know I should like them. There is a model in Europe that is actually holds them in the upper, you know, the highest kind of precedent studies. You know, we look at Barcelona housing, we look at European housing as the kind of the examples always, at least in North American context. And yet in your context, you're looking at them, you know you should like them somehow, but you've been raised to actually think they're absolutely ugly. So I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of these careful observations that you've made, and it's so illuminating and really inspiring to think how we can take this kind of practice and also look at our own local context for, you know, for this kind of biases that we might have.
Yeah, I think that's it's very interesting when, let's take it from the biggest market. Everybody knows what's going on in the US. Everybody knows the George Floyd, unfortunate George Floyd issue. And when we sit back, I can have deep debates here in Kenya over what is happening in George Floyd. And at one point I made a statement that made me sound very pro-US. And I said that I felt safer when I was in the US. And it's a very difficult thing for me to say. But I'm back here in Kenya because from a social perspective, I enjoyed, from a security perspective, I felt safer in the US. I felt my things were safer, nobody would steal. But from a social perspective, this was where I needed to be. I had my friends here, they understood me better. But I began to realize that once we get here, we remove ourselves from our own internal situation. And while we might know it academically, we might know it on the basis of books that there was neo-colonialism, and majority of Kenyans know about neo-colonialism. We don't truly internalize it to try and see how deep did it go. And I think this is where the words systemic and institutional go. And I can understand the frustrations of the African-American communities and some of the more marginalized communities in the US, because you'll be out there trying to say, it's so difficult for you to see because you can't live this experience. And it's difficult for me to see a fellow Kenyan's difficulty around almost being considered second class. And I know this might sound controversial, but the mere fact that we seem to think that the city shouldn't grow anymore actually suggests that some people should not come into the city, and yet they're Kenyans. So how do we think through all these things and occupying some of these spaces, sitting in some of these spaces, sitting and sketching on a Saturday afternoon and having a guy who was standing come and ask you, what are you doing? I mean, like, how do you have the time to sit and sketch? And are you just sketching? It's so perplexing. And then hearing their story. There's one guy who sells secondhand tiles, and he mentioned that business has been bad. And he says he wakes up at 5 a.m. and he asked us, just let me know what time, how much earlier should I wake up to really make it? And yeah, it's a struggle, but one that requires a lot of empathy. I wouldn't say I'm fully there because I'm still struggling with how to fully go. I mean, I'm struggling with things that have been in me for over 40 years. Yeah. I noticed a couple of questions on the chat. Can I just quickly try and respond to some of them?
Please.
Yes.
Okay, there was one asking about the funding model for the communities. So KDI actually does fundraise, and we do tend to have various donors who might give specific project-related money, which means that if we are dealing, say, with a water and sanitation project, if we go out and send an RFP, it will require that the organizations actually respond on the basis of that. So there is external funding, and it's funding from all sources. We'd be happy if, I think it was Christopher Mose, went into the KDI website. I should have actually indicated the link here as well, and see how they can offer. Some of the support is in terms of time. We do have partners such as Borough Happold. We have colleagues from ARUP. We have different design organizations who sometimes offer time, but there's also external funding in terms of money from donor sources. We've also won some competitions, some grant money. So it's multiple sources of funding. The communities don't self-fund, but we do want to make sure that they can create a sustainable model going forward in any of the spaces that are created. I think I saw one from my good friend, Konyo Gitonga, speaking about some of the troubles of the hanging of clothes. And maybe one of the things I can mention, Gitonga, to that is because as of designers have looked on this as an anthema, as this something that we don't want to do, we've not thought deeply enough about it. I've some current thoughts that we are trying to carry out in recent projects. However, I feel the baseline all stems from the fact that there's absolutely no more space beyond the houses actually filling all the spaces. And yes, there are deep considerations that we must have as designers now to actually first say hanging clothes is not bad, but what are the problems that come about through? I see you're mentioning that some clothes have to be hung out for 3 days to dry. People don't want to hang them at the top of the roof because you might not get enough space, or it's actually easier to have it right next to you. But lots of thoughts that we have to keep thinking through.
Arthur, there's also a question about what's the name of the book and how soon can we expect it?
I don't have the name yet. It's probably going to be sometime next year. I'm doing it with a good friend of mine called Gadogo Gidatu. And it's really about our journey in sketching and the thoughts. What happens as we sketch, we do tend to speak a lot. And one of the things we spoke about when we were asking about being lazy was Ha Jun Chang, I think the South Korean economist in Cambridge. In his book, Bad Samaritans, he talks about people are not lazy, they just have nothing to do. And in one of the things, he speaks about the fact that the Australians considered the Japanese lazy at one point. The English thought of the Germans as lazy in the 18th century. So it's really about how do we figure out these inequalities that have made all of us start at a different level. I did not choose to be born to my parents. I was just lucky. So the guy sanding, the guy selling the tiles was dealt a different card. I cannot begin to look at him and perceive him as being lazy. And I think those are some of the things that we need to think about as you're talking about systemic. to really understand what does it mean when you have we all starting at different points. We're all starting at different stages in life. Yeah.
There's another question here.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions here back to KDI. Does KDI find its own projects or propose their own projects?
That's an interesting question. I noticed Franklin is on. This is probably typed there. Franklin works with KDI. I saw Joe, the country director, was also on and might be able to jump in and respond to some of those. But it's KDI really goes out looking for projects. That was the original genesis, and really looking for opportunities, as I said, to work in under-resourced spaces. And one of the origins, even as we were founding KDI, when the first suggestion came out, and this was in 2006, that maybe we should start with Kibera, I will be very honest. I always tell this story. I told the rest of the team, I'm not sure. That is, I'm not sure we'll be able to actually start there. That's like starting at the most difficult point. And this is again where my biases come in. And it's good that the rest of the group were like, where better to start than in the most difficult circumstances. And it happened because I was doing a bit of an independent study at the time at the GSD, and I was saying that it is easier to attack the problem and some of the challenges in Kibera from a landscape perspective, from creating public spaces perspective, because buildings always generate a lot of heat. I think I shared my low-income housing project. The time required for building, the approvals required for building, the notion of who will actually own the buildings always come with a lot of heat. And there are a lot of programs trying to solve that. We should be very clear. But we at the point thought that why not then focus on public spaces, and especially focus on the most marginalized land, which we then began to figure out were the river edges, and see if we could create a network. And when the place transforms, hopefully these spaces will be so productive that everybody will keep them over time, because nobody's ever really going to build over the river. So there's a mix, a very good mix between seeking or having ideas around projects, but then very quickly, as I said, working with the community, because they define the projects. There's a strong participatory, a very strong participatory process within KDI for them to define what they actually need, what the program elements are, and also beginning to understand the budget that we might have that then develops the projects. Yeah.
Just in line with just what you have talked about, Arthur, I'm just wondering if somebody wants to partner with KDI, are there opportunities to do so, and if so, how?
Wow, fantastic! Just get in touch. Just get in touch. You can also get in touch through, I think I see Franklin has put up in the chat, he has put up the website.
Arthur, there's one other question here. When sketching and designing, how do you take into account the impact of noise, be it from the existing surroundings or from the proposed design?
Wow, that's That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
Especially of when sketching. I'll try and figure out the second part of design, but when sketching, this strange thing that it's actually making me reflective. I don't actually think about the noise. It becomes part of the whole, process. Remember I mentioned that before I never used to sketch from life, and I have progressively gone into more and more interesting spaces to sketch. And the areas are actually quite noisy. There's a lot of activity happening around, but I've never actually thought of the noisiness as noise, which is very interesting. That I will have to get back. I think it's John who asked. I'll have to get back on that question, and maybe it's something that we'd have to write and reflect about in terms of the noise. When designing, of course, that now takes a whole different realm. And it's really about what sort of space you're then creating. If you're seeking to create a space of contemplation, really have to figure out how you locate that, what sort of buffers you can put. But more often than not, I think most of the sounds that we find around life are actually quite interesting and attractive. You're hopefully not building a beautiful park right next to a steel factory or a coal factory. So I can't really imagine. But it's an interesting and fascinating question. I'll have to think a little bit deeper about that.
There is a comment here, Arthur. A lot of people have said that your work is really inspiring, and so has this person. They say, I think your book on sketching already has a name, Kounkuey, to get to know something intimately. Clearly what you're enacting while developing your sketches.
Yes. And I think I've seen the question, what language is Kounkuey? Kounkuey is actually Thai. Kach, who is one of the original founders and is doing some very fantastic work. You can find her, I'll try and type the correct spelling on, she has some very fascinating TED Talks on the work she's doing in Thai. Came up with the word. I think it means working together.
Arthur, I was wondering if you could maybe reflect on how this work has influenced your teaching, and you know, whether in your own teaching or even within your department more broadly, whether some of these kind of observations or approaches have been integrated into the teaching in some way.
I'm hoping some of my colleagues are here, so that if I critique them, we can continue the conversation. But one of the things, and I've presented my sketching and works from KDI, which was an original co-founder. And one of the things I was very clear about in the initial phases of KDI, and I still discuss with the CEO to this day, is, and it's going to sound strangely, I am very much a top-down person. And we said that this was a fantastic opportunity because the team was very much a bottom-up. And I felt that the work KDI was doing is very useful and very thoughtful, and something that I can keep contemplating even as I work in for-profit spaces. So the other hat I wear, I work with developers, fairly, perhaps the largest developers in Kenya. And I'm happy now that we are really trying to engage in the affordable housing space. So some of the lessons that I am learning from here are actually coming through. But in teaching, one of the real difficulties has been around defining landscape and defining some of this sort of work as landscape. And what KDI is really doing, which came out of a nexus of landscape architects, engineers, planners, architects, economists working together to create that productive public space, has made me realize that that exactly is landscape. And if my understanding, part of the origins of the word landscape always includes man's relationship and working the land. So what has tended to happen a lot in our teaching is that a lot of it emanated from a more picturesque type of landscape. And it's a struggle that we are going through in trying to understand that landscape is not just, doesn't need outdoor. I'm using the word outdoor because most of the times I ran a small experiment before doing this talk and asked several people to define landscape, and majority of them would want to use the word outdoor. So they were presenting this from the perspective that there's building and then there's the other. There's Elizabeth Meyer would say there's the male and the female, and architecture is the male, landscape architecture is the female. And the struggle is to try and see how to redefine that landscape so that we begin to see the opportunity that it is more than just about plants and flowers and the picturesque, but that is extremely important. But how then you include that in something that is actually productive and useful is where the real direction is going. I mean, where is the direction that we really should be going to? So it's an ongoing struggle. And I'm happy to say, I see Franklin commenting. The two projects you've seen here, Franklin is a student from the department who really took up a lot of this type of work and great interest. I took a great interest in it. I'm happy to see that that's beginning to develop a little. It is something that we have not done as much of within the teaching. But obviously, as you can see, my struggle in trying to explain, it's something that we would want to make sure we can engage a lot more of. I think I've gone over and over without really answering the question.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, it sounds like the kind of these are very fruitful and ongoing debates about redefining what landscape architecture is. And I mean, I think you and I have talked about this before as well, about the kind of the push and pull on how much do you make landscape strictly instrumental when you lose the kind of the beauty, spiritual and cultural aspect of it, and keeping that balance between, I mean, we can speak endlessly about that male-female dichotomy. I think was very much part of the last couple of decades of this attempt to machoize landscape architecture with
tactical urbanism and, you know, that kind of aspects of making landscape get the, you know, so-called muscles that they felt architecture has and landscape doesn't because it's soft. But yeah, I think it's, you know, these are ongoing discussions, I think, but it's very interesting, and I'd love to continue our conversations and dialogue, sort of cross-academic, interinstitutional conversations, and maybe potentially collaborations and exchanges once COVID is over, to see how we can learn more from one another, and the different perspectives, and the different perspectives specifically in teaching, but also what's happening on the ground in Nairobi versus Toronto would be fascinating.
Fantastic. Maybe the one thing I wanted to add to that is I do like to tell my students that we are in an interesting space in Kenya because landscape is still a very young profession. I think the department first started in 2003. And there's an opportunity to define what landscape is that may even be different from a definition that you'd have in Canada, in the US. And there's an opportunity to appropriate more without necessarily struggling, as you said, to make it more macho, but really to be able to say that there's so much missing and there's so much not being attended to, and critically working in teams and working with several different disciplines. I think that's one of the most profound things I have seen out of KDI, because KDI cannot really state that they're a landscape firm or an engineering firm or a planning firm. It's everything brought in together consistently, and each project always commences that way. And I think that's one of the richest learnings that I would pick out of KDI.
Yeah, indeed, a great model for also co-production with community, right? It's really embedded. You were noting how if you don't have the community engaged, then the spaces, no matter how well designed they may be, they don't last and they get overtaken by something else. And that kind of embedding that design process in a community and making it a true partnership is really fascinating. Something we truly need to learn from. So I want to thank you, Arthur, for joining us today and for sharing your insights and your fantastic drawings. It was such a delight to see. And you have a lot of well-wishing from all of the participants today, noting how inspiring your talk was, how inspiring and brilliant your drawings are, and your observations and insights. And wishing you good luck with the publication as well. And and as I said, on a personal note, I am so excited that we got to reconnect. I was thinking as you were speaking that we should dedicate this event to Patrick Curran.
Very much so.
Who
Yes.
passed away way too young, and was one of the co-founders of KDI. And that I really truly look forward to continuing this conversation and looking for ways to find ways to collaborate between our two schools. And I also want to express my gratitude to Kaari. Thank you so much for helping to organize and host this event. Want to also thank the Daniels Public Programming Committee for organizing the series, Aiden and Nini for their tireless work behind the scenes and during the event. And want to invite the rest of you to join us for other Daniels events this year. I'll direct you to the Daniels website to news and events to see the full list. Our next event in the series is the Jeffrey Cook Memorial Lecture, and Kelly Duran will be presenting the 2020-2021 Jeffrey Cook Memorial Lecture titled Towards Half, Designing for a Climate Positive Future, which will take place this Friday, October 30th at 1 o'clock. So thanks again, Arthur. It was so fabulous to see you, hear you. Thanks again, Kaari.
Thank you, and thanks all for the kind comments. It's very inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. Thank you, Liat.
And thank you all for joining us. Have a fabulous rest of your day.